So then we are back with the modern understandings from the Renewed Covenant from the Aramaic English translation of the Word. This translation is from the original documents of the Hebrews of old, from the time of Israel, giving us then the bearings for us to get our own of the future and what to do and how to behave, what kind of adjustments should be made. And then regarding the rebuilding of the holy cities, we understand then from the 61st chapter of Yeshayahu, then the city and the cities, but then the rebuilding makes a reference of the city on a desert, because the city of God was then built on a desert, the first city. Then the cities was then making a reference of the second tabernacle services. So then, understanding the layer that comes from these, then you find layers and layers, and you have to know how to link those layers. Then, as the time went on, we understand Israel was taken captive many times. Scriptures were burned. Then the country was then in uproar. City was destroyed, temple destroyed, tabernacle or temple destroyed. Then later they had to return and then rewrite. Sometimes when they would rewrite, some of the words sometimes in the sentences, they had to be adjusted. Some sections of it you find, then Yahweh would make them a new covenant. But it's not a new covenant. It was the previous covenant made with Abraham. It was a new start of maintenance of the pre-existing covenant. So then we are becoming more acquainted with some of the adjustments that must be made. When we find in ourselves speaking of the refurbishment or then the restoration, you find then areas of the world where then tabernacling would be made. So then if you read Yeshayahu, then it states of Ethiopia. And tabernacling, from the original manuscripts of Hebrews, you find the word tabernacling. But those are related with the layer of the rebuilding. Those are the areas of the rebuilding of the cities. Because as Yohanan started then, the city model from the city of the desert and onwards, then the people later, when they would go out in sets of people, then they would set up holy cities. So they had then previously a place where they would model themselves with. Yohanan was the first. He was then the first Shaliach. Then from the discipleship of the Messiah, he had the entire scripture in his hand. He was able then to read the entire scripture in line, neatly build up and then pile up precisely as per times and seasons, and he knew the prophecies. Then they had the tabernacle build up in their city as per the instructions of the Messiah, go around the world and form holy cities. So he was then the first city. From then on, then they were copying from the city. So then the refurbishment of the cities, you can find a very straight point where then a complete city, as per instruction, then from the time of Yohanan, then taken from the time of Moses. Then you find that the city is going to be built in a place where a person doesn't last very long if a person lies. And the place is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, in the land of Cush. Tabernacling. Some people say, why has then Yahweh decided to build himself up in the midst of a fierce people and then in the midst of a chaos? It's because he shows his mighty hand. And no person would be lying around. Because you can read, tabernacling amongst the fierce. Because many centuries earlier, they did trade with Israel when then the king was obedient. And nations would then come and bring gifts in exchange for the wisdom of Solomon. And these people, they were part of it during the time. Because then was the time for Israel to be the leader of this world during their time. So they used to do trade with Israel when they were obedient. And many times the leaders of the time of the land of Cush, they would also go up and do trade and then giving gifts for hearing the words of the Creator. And they retain the identity of being honest, straightforward, and wanting to do trade. But then when Israel went down, then the land of Cush remained strong beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. Land of Cush. And they retained the honesty and the trade deal that they used to have. From then on, countries went down and they always retained a very honest understanding. And they know when people are lying around. That's why then it was chosen, the very in the midst of the fears. Because then his city would be in truth, as per the design of Yohanan. And the design of Yohanan was from the first city designed by the city in the desert. However, he did understand the Hebrews, and then he also did understand the updates from the first service and the second service. So then they start exercising the second service. But then the layerings of it, we have to understand how to read it. Tabernacling, the holy word tabernacling. There is no other place in the world ever that Yahweh would tabernacle outside of the holy city. Then the prophet himself said tabernacling, would tabernacle. Gives you then the answer. The holy cities are returning. Study the word tabernacling. What does it mean? When the Messiah came, he tabernacled with us. Time of restoration. While the world then secularly rebuilds, then also the holy cities. And interesting enough, then we are going to spend part of our technologies and then part of our new technologies, we must require rare materials. Where do you find rare materials? Beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. As we are rebuilt, then the land of Cush or Congo then is rebuilt. So this gives us then the certainty of then understanding the scriptures in layers. It's a very important, momentous time. And then, so much so, parts of even the prophecy itself states of blowing of the shofar. Know what it means? Seasons, times and seasons. Speaking of then spring and harvest. Tabernacling, spring, autumn, harvest. Speaking of the scripture. But we, Westerners, we were always taught in flat surfaces and we never did truly understand the times and seasons. Because the understanding and giver of the entire understanding of this section is the word tabernacling. The word tabernacling in Hebrew is not the same as inhabitants. It's not the same word. When it speaks of tabernacling, it is a particular word only exclusive for Yahweh's presence. Tabernacling with us. The people, or the inhabitants, And any other similar word is not the same as tabernacling. Because they were taught from times and seasons. We were not. So at the moment they hear the holy word tabernacling, they know it's Yahweh. And at the moment we understand that the second tabernacle services is Yahweh Yeshua. But then the model is from the time of the desert. It has a link with Yahanan on the city. So it's linking up. Please stay tuned, much more coming up.